Now, the rest of the story. About 60 years ago, a little more than that, I suppose, movies and radio held up shining examples of American youth in the fictional persons of Henry Aldrich and Andy Hardy. Either of those make-believe characters, those scrubbed portraits of ideal boyhood, might have been patterned after a real-life Indiana farm boy who had preceded them. His name was Johnny. From the moment he was born, Johnny was the sort of youngster who makes childless couples long for children. The star of the family album. You should see the faded photographs. Adorable, wide-eyed youngster on his tricycle. The same boy perched on the seat of his father's horse-drawn wagon. After a few years, Johnny began taking piano lessons from Mrs. Hancock. He tried his best, but the piano was no match for the lure of baseball. And he was a fine baseball player. Batting, base running, fielding, pitching. Johnny could do it all, and with a skill that raised some grown-ups' eyebrows. Major league material, folks used to say. And Johnny grew taller and stronger. In school he got average grades, maybe a little above. In fact, the only aspect of his youth in which he was not completely normal was that he rarely ever got into trouble. The only fighting he did was in friendly wrestling matches. When the other boys said enough, Johnny would quit and the two would shake hands. One schoolmate grew up to recall that Johnny was the only boy who never stole, not as much as a nickel, from other boys' desks. After high school, Johnny got a job in a veneer mill. The other workmen liked him a lot. His pleasant personality, his willingness to help out, even when his job did not call for it. Later, Johnny worked in a machine shop. His employer became quite fond of him, called Johnny very fast and accurate, sober and honest, very industrious. And then Johnny fell in love. And I wish I didn't have to tell you the rest of the story. The little girl with whom Johnny became enamored was named Frances Thornton. She was the stepdaughter of Johnny's Uncle Everett. She was extraordinarily pretty. Frances was 17, and Johnny was 20, when Johnny asked his uncle for Frances's hand. Uncle Everett said no. He said there was a nice boy who lived in Greencastle whom he had chosen as Frances's future husband, and he, Uncle Everett, forbade Johnny ever to call on Frances again. Frances said she would stand by her stepfather's wishes, and that was that, and Johnny was crushed. The next thing you know, farm boy Johnny had fled to the big city, to Indianapolis, where he was seen in the company of prostitutes, where he was known to have stolen a car, and yes, that was where it all began. He had been the star of the family album. He had been a walking model of American boyhood until the summer of 1923, when a romantic rejection pulled the emotional trigger that turned Honest John into public enemy number one, John Dillinger. John Dillinger. Now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. You know, it's amazing how far one can fall from grace. As Mr. Harvey explained, John Dillinger went from being a hometown star to public enemy number one. For some reason, we tend to romanticize thugs and gangsters. Several films have been made about John Dillinger, most notable of which was the 2009 film Public Enemies, starring Johnny Depp as John Dillinger. Although I'm a Johnny Depp fan, films such as Public Enemies portray thugs such as John Dillinger as role models. For at least 95% of this type of movies, the bad guys appear to be living exciting lives full of fast cars, hot women, and lots of money. It's usually the last few moments of the film, sometimes only seconds on screen, where the bad guy finally gets his due. Hollywood can certainly tell a good tale, but Hollywood films and historical facts are rarely good companions. But that's a whole other story. John Herbert Dillinger was born on June the 22nd, 1903, in Oak Hill, a suburb of Indianapolis, Indiana. His father, John Wilson Dillinger, was a grocer. In 1907, when John was just 4 years old, his mother, Molly, died shortly after having a stroke. John's father eventually remarried and had other children. John spent most of his time in the care of his older sister, Audrey. According to Mr. Harvey, John Dillinger was a model child and teenager. Was this accurate? The teenage Dillinger got into trouble regularly for fighting and stealing. There are stories that he bullied smaller children. He eventually quit school and went to work in a machine shop. Still getting into trouble, John's father relocated the family to a rural farm in Mooresville, Indiana, about 20 miles southwest of Indianapolis. This move happened in 1921. In the following year, 1922, John was arrested for stealing a car. In 1923, John enlisted in the U.S. Navy. As a fireman third class, he served aboard a battleship called the USS Utah. But when the ship docked in Boston, John deserted. In December of 1923, John met Beryl Ethel, they called her Burley, Hovius, at a party in Mooresville. They married in April 1924. Shortly after 10 o'clock on the night of September the 6th of the same year, John Dillinger and Ed Singleton robbed a grocery store called West End Grocery. During the robbery, one of the men, purportedly John Dillinger, struck 65-year-old Frank Morgan, owner of the grocery store, over the head with a heavy bolt wrapped in a handkerchief. They had hoped to knock Frank out, but Frank fought with John while Ed gathered money from the register. During the scuffle, a pistol John had been carrying hit the floor and discharged, but the bullet didn't take effect, didn't hit anybody. John and Ed fled from the store with $50. A local minister recognized John and Ed as they ran from the store and reported this to police. John and Ed were arrested the following day. John was eventually sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. Prison was like college to John. Every waking hour, he heard plans and schemes. John was learning from the best criminals. Well, maybe not the best at eluding police, but he was surrounded by safecrackers, car thieves, bank robbers, and murderers. His wife, Beryl, visited him at the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City once a month. But in 1927, her visits ended abruptly. In 1929, she divorced John and married another man. John's daily routine in prison revolved around his preparations for his real criminal career. After serving 9.5 years in prison, which was 9.5 years of criminal education, John was paroled on May the 10th, 1933. On June the 21st, 6 weeks to the day after being released, John robbed the New Carlisle National Bank of Carlisle, Ohio, of $10,000. Less than 2 months later, he robbed a bank in Bluffton, Ohio. Police tracked him down and arrested him shortly thereafter. 4 days after his arrest, John and 6 other men escaped from their jail cells. John and an ever-changing group of criminals continued robbing banks, and the press dubbed them the John Dillinger Gang. Just before closing time on Monday afternoon, January 15, 1934, John and 2 other men walked into the First National Bank of East Chicago, and the robbery began. A 4th robber waited in the getaway car outside. As the robbers were scooping up the money, police surrounded the bank. The 3 men, armed with machine guns, fought their way out of the bank. John used Walter Spencer, the bank's vice president, as a human shield until they reached the curb. Policeman William Patrick O'Malley shot the gun out of the hands of one of the robbers. Another one of the robbers, John Dillinger by most accounts, shot Patrick multiple times. Despite being mortally wounded by machine gun fire, Patrolman O'Malley returned fire multiple times. 4 of those bullets struck John in the chest, but he was wearing a bulletproof vest. John purportedly fired the shots that killed a 45-year-old policeman, devoted husband, father of 3 daughters, William Patrick O'Malley. This is the only photo I could locate of William Patrick O'Malley. Most modern accounts of John Dillinger's bank robberies fail to mention the name of the policeman who was killed, but I want you to know his name. William Patrick O'Malley. John Dillinger's crime spree is the stuff of legend. He had numerous escapes, close calls, and purportedly had plastic surgery to help him in his criminal career. But all things must end. On July 21st, 1934, Anna Sage Campagnas, I hope I'm pronouncing her last name right, a madam from a brothel in Gary, Indiana, contacted the FBI with information about John Dillinger. She said she, a prostitute named Polly Hamilton, and John were planning to see a movie together the following day in Chicago. FBI agents and police made their plans. At about 8:30 on the evening of July 22nd, Sage, Polly, and John entered the Biograph Theater, that's it behind me, and watched the crime drama, Manhattan Melodrama, starring three of my Hollywood favorites, Clark Gable, Myrna Loy, and William Powell. FBI agents and police officers waited outside. When the trio exited the theater at about 10:40 p.m., John realized the jig was up and ran down the street into the alley. As John was pulling his pistol from his pocket, three agents, Clarence Hurt, Charles Winstead, and Herman Hollis, fired their weapons at the fleeing bank robber. Dillinger was struck 4 times and died instantly. 2 female bystanders were wounded by stray bullets. Teresa Paulus was shot in the hip. Etta Natowski was shot in the leg, but both recovered from their bullet wounds. A reported 15,000 people viewed John Dillinger's body before his funeral. How many people do you think visited the body of slain policeman whose name I'm proud to say once again? William Patrick O'Malley. 50? Maybe 100? If the young people of our country remember anything from the stories, the movies about gangsters and bank robbers, it shouldn't be the romanticized accounts with famous actors spouting clever lines which were carefully written and firing blanks into the air. They should know that every action has consequences. They should remember pictures such as this one, which shows a 31-year-old young bank robber who could have done anything, lying dead on a gurney because he chose a life of crime. That's where crime leads. Prison and an early death. There is no future in crime. We need to expose our children and grandchildren to positive role models. Don't you think? I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And now you know the rest of the story.